and the Honda Accord have thousands of similarities and probably thousands of interchangeable parts. But that doesn't prove they came from a Chevy. It proves they came from the same designer. So the evidence you're giving is classic. It can be used just as well as evidence for creation. So I don't see why I should have to pay for your particular interpretation of this evidence to be taught to all the kids as science, when it's simply your religion. It's something you believe.
Dr. Hovind, another question addressed at you. The question is based on first principles. If the first principles of religion begin with God, how did God come into being? And if God wasn't created, then doesn't this imply the possibility that matter can in fact create itself?
Well, there really are only two options that anybody's been able to figure out. Somebody created the universe, or it created itself. The only ones with a third option are those out there on the lunatic fringe who would say, we're not really here at all, we just think we're here. We are here. And everything we see is winding down. We see stars blow up, nova or supernova. We see everything degenerating. So that would say there must have been a beginning. And just the simple concept of geometry, with infinity, if matter is infinitely old, and if time is indeed eternal, if time has always been here, then you really couldn't get to today, because when did it start? I mean, just the fact that we're here today proves there was a beginning. There has to be a beginning to this time. The Bible's very clear in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The beginning is a reference to time. God started time. In the beginning, God created the heaven, a reference to space. God created time and space and matter. Those three are a continuum. One cannot exist without the other. You cannot have matter without space. You cannot have matter and space without time. The three had to come into existence simultaneously. Now, the fact that God is outside of that and is beyond my comprehension makes him worthy of worship.
Dr. Morrow, response?
My response, this is a question that it sort of comes in on a personal level, and so I have to sort of answer it on that level. I guess I would start by saying, in direct response to the question, which was, what is God?
If God came into being without the effect of a creator, doesn't that demonstrate the possibility that matter can in fact create itself?
Yeah, I simply haven't a clue. How can anyone know that? And I'm one of those people for whom logical consistency is very important. And I am a scientist in my thought processes at home as well as in my laboratory and office. And the nature of God, the nature of the beginning, falls outside of the scientific method. The science just doesn't deal with that. And because I practice science in my thinking at all times, I'm necessarily an agnostic. It's the only logical conclusion, it seems to me, that one can come to. There's no way of knowing the nature of God. And I counsel those of you who follow our religious faith that you be aware of the diversity of religions, and that many people have very distinct concepts of God and the nature of things than you do, and that somehow, among other things, you have to have come to trust your own belief system and those that are leading you, and I think you should be very, very wary of that.
One last question, and then there will be some closing remarks, and I believe we will break for some fellowship. This question was addressed to Dr. Moore specifically, and that is, Darwin essentially believed that given enough time, the fossil record would fill in the gaps, and yet, as we've heard today, that hasn't actually happened. As a scientist, how do you relegate your views and your beliefs in evolution with the fact that there are still missing links.
Yeah, that's simply a misconception of what Darwin said. Darwin, in fact, Darwin is in many ways the founding father of this concept that the fossil record is very incomplete and will never be filled in completely. We know, among other things, from the processes of fossilization that there are certain kinds of organisms that simply don't fossilize well. I have the misfortune of working on one of the groups that do not fossilize well, birds, because they have small, fragile, thin bones, and many of them are forest-dwelling species that when they die, they fall on acidic soils and they simply perish before they can become mineralized. And so no one anticipated or anticipates that the fossil record is going to be filled in. I would point out also, and let me state it this way, that if there were no fossil record at all, and this is plausible, I mean, it's really a rare event that results in the fossilization of a dead animal, and it's entirely conceivable that there would be no fossil record. I would argue that we still would have discovered evolution, that evolution as a theory does not rely on the fossil record. And I restate that the fossil record, as it exists, as poor as it is completely consistent with the theory of evolution and highly inconsistent with the Genesis hypothesis because of the stratigraphy and the dates, which I've mentioned before.
Dr. Hovind?
Yes, I appreciate you stating that no one anticipates the fossil record will be filled in. And yet there are literally trillions and trillions of fossils in the world. To say that fossilization is a rare event is true today, but the very existence of these trillions of fossils. I was just in Lompoc, California, in the diatomaceous earth quarry out there, where they find in unbelievable volumes of fossils. The Karoo Formation in Africa, they estimate, has 800,000 billion, or 800 trillion fossils of vertebrate animals in one formation in Africa. The existence of fossils is not the problem, folks. The existence of intermediate fossils is the problem, which I think the fossil record is clear evidence the animals were created after their kind. There's never been an exception to that. We don't find any evidence of the trillions of fossils available that shows there's been any change from one kind of animal to another. If you want to go with a species, there might be some evidence that there's been, some speciation, but I don't know that I would like to use that word. I stick with the word kind. And to say that the fossil record is consistent with the theory is just simply not true. Stephen Gould said, and Niles Eldredge said, and you yourself said tonight, you follow the idea of neo-Darwinism, which, if I understand what you're saying, is the punctuated equilibrium model of Stephen Gould.
No, that's incorrect. I meant to correct that earlier. But.
Okay, do you agree with Stephen Gould, then, that the fossil record does not show intermediates, therefore evolution must have happened in jumps, in small populations?
Do I have 10 minutes to address that question? I mean, one cannot address Steve Gould in any less than 10 minutes.
Well, let's get Steve Gould back. People that were here when Steve Gould was here and offered to let me come debate him, and he refused. I would be glad to do that also. I'm just a high school science teacher, that's all. I'm no great scientist, but I'm sick and tired of this propaganda being pushed off on these kids, that's all.
I'd like to thank